My name is Tony Mancuso. As Risa said, I work for the state of Utah Department of Natural Resources as the Green and Colorado River Program Manager. And so today, we're going to talk a bit about using chainsaws in boat-in only restoration sites. So these are areas where we don't have vehicle access and maybe more of a backcountry setting, and the added complications that come from using this type of equipment in that kind of setting. And so quick outline, the talk we're going to run through the day is we're going to orient ourselves around the landscapes that we're talking about, specifically what I mean when I say riparian corridor, kind of like set the stage a little bit. We'll talk about why we choose this type of restoration practice. There are certain ecological indicators and thresholds that show this is the right way we need to approach this project. In this photo here, you can see a prescribed burn in the Moab Valley, early photo from, I think that's 1993, but a restoration site in progress here in the riparian corridor along the Colorado River. That's the US 191 bridge right behind. I was just looking through the files. I thought that was a neat old photograph and figured I would include it. We'll talk a bit about logistics and safety. That's a big part of the conversation. Is safety is of paramount importance, especially around riparian chainsaw work. And the wind just took my neighbor's RV and tossed it. It's a very windy day here in Moab. Getting distracted. Using these tools in the riparian backcountry context, it adds a lot of complexity to our planning considerations. And so we're going to talk a lot about logistics, things that help our crews be more safe, more effective, and more efficient. And then finally, we're going to talk about the usefulness of chainsaws. It's not always the right tool to use. There are some better ideas that we can deploy when busting out the saw might not be the right way to go about the project for a variety of needs. And so first off, kind of like give you a little bit of background on the setting here. My main focus is in the main stem of the Green and Colorado River. So these are large navigable rivers with very varying flow regimes. They can be as low as 1,500 CFS or as high as 60,000 CFS. But we're focusing here on the riparian corridor. And to be a little bit more specific, that's that littoral and phreatic zone adjacent to the surface water. I know various states define riverbeds administratively and legally in different ways, but ecologically speaking, this is that place where the river water underground is interacting with the groundwater adjacent to it, the root zones, that's called the hypoaric zone of the river. And you can see in this photo here, this is one of my river rangers, Will Tuttle's rehabbing an egregious pallet fire we had in Uinta County on the Green River. We pulled something like 10 pounds of mist. That's beside the point. But in this photo, you can kind of see this this bench that's the littoral zone. It's covered up with native grasses and forbs, more herbaceous plants. And immediately behind that, we have a row of tamarisk. These are exotic woody species that come in. They're sometimes classified as invasive. We'll get a little bit more into that later. And also cottonwood galleries. Now, cottonwoods in my neck of the woods are the primary prize tree to have along the riparian corridor for wildlife habitat, for shade, for recreation, for scenery. And we want to preserve cottonwoods and eliminate tamarisk and Russian olive are the two main species on the Green in Colorado. But in other rivers across the country, you may be working on multifloral rose or Japanese knotweed. But the idea is generally, we'll circle back to this, oftentimes the invasive woody plants in the riparian corridor don't reach very large size classes. These aren't ponderosas, these aren't Douglas firs, these aren't cottonwood size organisms. They're more often better characterized as a shrub than a bush. And that's a big part of the strategy that we go into when we're talking about how to use chainsaws in the riparian corridor. So why, though? Why can't we just let it be? There's a lot of research coming out recently. It had been the thinking for a long time that tamarisk specifically was this water thief of a plant that was out competing and making the rivers dry up and really harming cottonwood galleries that way. Current understanding, this is from USGS in 2021, shows that these exotic phreatophytes, as they're called, don't actually use very much more water than their equivalent biomass of cottonwoods or willows or oaks. But the trick is that these exotic plants present a very large risk from wildland fire fuel. So as tamarisk and Russian olive encroach upon the understory of our cottonwood galleries, a lightning strike, an errant campfire, fireworks will combust those very flammable exotic species. And those species are just tall enough to carry fire into the crown of cottonwood galleries. And that's when we start to lose cottonwood galleries to wildland fire, and it's very, very difficult, almost impossible to reestablish legacy cottonwood galleries in areas that have been impacted by wildfire. So we need to go in there without using fire as a tool and manually remove these ladder fuels from the cottonwood galleries. In the photo on this slide is a photo taken from the air of the Bonot Bend fire in 2019. There was also a fire at this exact same spot in 2020 that burned the other direction and went downstream. But this was a large stand of gamble oak and cottonwood trees, and an errant campfire, voters who misdisposed of their campfire ashes in a dry pile of leaves, of all places. This fire started and took out 20 acres of native woody riparian corridor habitat for turkey, deer, desert bighorns, all manner of birds and wildlife. So this is what motivates us to do this work, to prevent these kinds of things from happening. So what do our work sites look like before we get into them? This is on the Colorado River adjacent to the Moab Daily. It's taken from BLM land looking out onto the Colorado River. And in the midground here, we see this dense thicket of tamarisk trees. Maybe the tallest might be 15 feet tall, but it is nearly impassable snag of branches, maybe between 1.5 and 4 inches in diameter. And as you can imagine, if an ignition starts in this dry, dead, oily hardwood thicket, it's going to be very large flame heights, and it's going to move very quickly. And so these sites are, there's no road access here. We had to take a raft to get to this site. We need to, in order to work effectively and not spend all of our time driving in and driving out to the boat ramp and boating all day long, we had to stay here for a couple of days, right? So we're talking about a backcountry trip, definitely not designated, but wilderness characteristics abound in this area. It's far from definitive medical care. Now, in the background here, you can also see a more vibrant green ribbon along the riverbank. So that's a site we have finished work, as opposed to just getting started in the midground. We went into that cottonwood gallery, we took out all the ladder fuels, and now those trees have more room to grow. There's less competition. It's looking a lot better on the downstream end. So what do we need to do when we think about getting into these sites and working safely? What do the work site tell us about how we need to be prepared to restore the area? It's hot, it's backcountry, and so sorry, one real quick. Let me find my spot here. Yes, so we're going through. This is sort of a little exercise I do with my crew more heavily at the start of the season, but we planogram out all of our boats. So our standard boat is a 16-foot rowboat with a small outboard motor. And if you've ever been on a multi-day river trip before, you can imagine those rafts are already packed to the gills with all manner of food, waste management, kitchen supplies, personal effects, sleeping gear, chairs, coolers, things you just need to be comfortable when you're in the desert backcountry for as many as 8 days. And the big question is, how do we facilitate all of that and at the same time facilitate a chainsaw hitch and all of that accompanying equipment with the same boat, right? With one boat or two boats. And we've just, the solution there is to get really creative with these boats being full to the brim. So for example, rather than a full 25-pound propane tank like you have on your propane grill outside, we've downsized. Our propane tank is only a 5-gallon tank. It's a lot smaller to fit. Folks who are familiar in the Wildland Fire Service will know the 25-inch bar on a gas-powered chainsaw is kind of like 25 is the standard bar length for NWCG purposes. At the very least, we size that down to 20 or 18, just got us a couple more inches, slightly smaller saw. We're looking whenever possible to sort of like shrink everything a little bit so that we can have more room at the end for other things. The spirit of this example really is that a lot of times when you're dealing with the large rowboats, there's sort of a like, oh, just bring it along mentality. At least I don't have to carry it on my back. I don't have to deal with the mule train or anything like that. So you can just throw it in the boat and go. But we still look at every little piece of gear and ask ourselves, like, does it need to be that large? Do we need that much of this? We get really, really specific and really cut through the margins of what is extraneous and what is absolutely necessary. So that brings us to safety gear specifically. I'm going to spend a good bit of time on this, just sort of demonstrating all the junk that goes into making these trips happen. Your standard issue, anybody who's taken a chainsaw class knows, your hard hat, your chaps, your glasses, ear plugs, long sleeve pants and shorts, leather boots. You want to be in your chacos when you're on the river, and then you got to get changed into all this big heavy gear. This is Ranger Sam Newman here, running a full-size gas chainsaw in excellent PPE. That's good job, Sam. Happy to see that. There's one thing that I'm going to tap real quick, something that we've adopted, and every agency's guidelines are different. I have to kind of put in the disclaimer here that always consult your current agency policy and your leadership with what necessary training is required, what minimum equipment standards are required for this kind of work. It's always good to make sure that we're doing it to the letter of the rule book. So we've recently adopted this little guy as a new conservation tool, as opposed to the large chainsaw that you see Sam hucking around here. These saws are called top handle chainsaws. They've been used commonly with arborists and the International Society of Arboriculture in rope work and tree climbing and aerial arborism for many years. And we're now seeing the advent of battery-powered top handle chainsaws. And so, rather than having to bring along extra bar oil, extra fuel, 2-cycle oil, funnels for mixing, yada, 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 this is a really simple solution in that, as long as you make sure your batteries are charged before you go on the trip. This saw only weighs about 8 pounds compared to 13 pounds with this 362 right here. One battery gets us about 6 hours of operation. Couple other things I really like about this saw are that it runs a pico gauge chain, so it's a little bit thinner. That does dull faster, but it also sharpens faster. So there's a trade-off there. The really big benefits that I like about this chainsaw are, we'll talk a bit more about environmental safety later, but because there's no gasoline, because there's no fuel, because there's no exhaust, the environmental safety benefits really strongly with this equipment. I always worry we put down a hot saw in the duff in the riparian corridor. We're trying not to start a fire, and we've got this hot exhaust in a pile of dry leaves. You don't need to be quite as specific as like, this is your fueling station. and all that here. So there are some drawbacks too with the top handle chainsaw. Some important things to know when we're working, especially with top handle saws and electronic saws, because they are smaller and lighter. Inexperienced sawyers are even more at risk. It's easy to get going too fast. It's easy to not be watching where the end of your bar is. It's really tempting to operate this saw with one hand, which is something that you should never be doing. And so it takes a little bit more experience and patience and a calm mindset to safely use this chainsaw. And another thing, why I mentioned agency guidance, is that there is some uncertainty about how effective Kevlar chaps can be when using electronic chainsaws. There's a lot more torque on the low end with these lithium batteries. And so I haven't seen any definitive guidance from my agency or peers about absolutely go or no go on these electronic saws, but it is something to be aware of. There is some questionable effectiveness of chaps with electronic saws, and so just need to be substantially more careful when using this kind of equipment for different reasons. Nusa Hudis. So on top of all the chainsaw project safety gear, it's important to remember that these restoration projects are also happening in the context of a river trip, a whitewater river trip in many circumstances. And so you need to have all of that chainsaw operation stuff that you're familiar with from conservation corps work, trail crews, and things like that. And then you're coupling that entirely with all of the stuff you'll see on a river ranger team, your ropes and pulleys and helmets and PFDs, whistles. And so you have to figure out a way to facilitate both values on one trip. It takes an extra level of coordination and forethought and planning. Oh, pardon me, guys. Still trying to read my notes off of my phone because I'm a silly goose. Be considering ways to best organize your gear. My point here with looking at all the chainsaw, all the project work considerations that you have to do, and then all the river trip kind of considerations that you have to do. We use two rafts on a 4-person team with my crew, and one raft is the project raft where we have chainsaws, gasoline if necessary, all our hand tools, chaps, equipment, boots. One raft is there to support the conservation project, and the other raft is there to support the river trip. So safety gear, camp gear, food, kitchen items, sanitation, we keep those two things separated. And it becomes very effective as you think about organizing your trip plan to have maybe one team working on the conservation site and then another team that's able to quickly break away and have camp set up or find a spot to camp or just be ready with lunch or things like that. We'll talk a little bit more about planning and logistics for the crew lead in that way, but having those two and the trip tempo. But it's been really helpful, a good addition, kind of like as SOP, to have one boat be the conservation boat and one boat be the river trip boat. Group safety, real quick, stop and talk about that. I think is its own sort of topic. It's not just keeping a sawyer safe out there and then also being safe on a river trip. Then there's a third layer of like, is the group going to be working safely together out there on the river? So I always say the most important safety tool that you have on a river trip or on a chainsaw project is your own voice. So cultivating a culture of open communication is paramount. If anybody sees something, if anybody has a concern, they need to bring that up immediately. So a culture of communication is the number one safety item there. If we can talk about it early on, if we can catch something that's bad early on, we can mitigate it. And so I try to have folks check in, particularly for crew leads or river trip leaders. What I coach is to have a check-in at every mealtime. This is a really convenient time because usually work has stopped. It's a quieter portion of the day for an hour here or an hour there. But it's also really good tempo wise because it's at the morning and the middle of the day and then at the end of the day. So there's a really organic sort of like, this is what's going to happen. This is what the next 4 hours look like. And this is what we got done today. That's great. Here's what I would like the morning to look like. And so having that 3 times a day, what does the next 4 hours look like? Check in regularly so we can address safety concerns, or hey, this broke, or hey, I haven't seen the inReach. Do you know where that's at? Now, so after communication, the second most important safety item, at least where I am, is the water cooler. Um, it gets very hot. We suspend our work through the month of August down here in southern Utah because it's just 110, 115 degrees in the bottom of these river canyons, and we can't have people doing this kind of arduous labor in those conditions. It's not safe. But bringing that up, what group safety gear is necessary? Where do we find room for that? Sometimes the boats are just packed, but we're drinking lots of water. And circling back to communications, but in a different way, making sure everyone on your team knows and is able to communicate the emergency plan. If an accident happens, do they know how to operate the radio? Do they know what that conversation with dispatch looks like? If there's an accident, can they effectively communicate where they are, what they need? And making sure everyone is trained up and efficient, because we can't always just assume like, oh, the crew leader will handle the radio. What if the crew leader is the one involved in the accident, right? So having everybody trained up in this setting is vital to make sure that we're all operating safely out there. Last and absolutely not least, I wanted to talk a lot about this, is that environmental safety component. The thesis here is that if we're out there to improve ecological conditions along the river corridor, we must not be the reason that any ecological harm comes to the river corridor. So when talking about conservation work, we oftentimes find ourselves using herbicide to treat stumps or control noxious weeds. Those kinds of chemicals become incredibly more risky when we're talking about working in the riparian corridor. We need to time the application and treatments and herbicide treatments so that there's no risk of contaminating water supplies or fish habitat. There are 4 listed fish in the rivers that I operate on, 3 endangered fish and 1 threatened fish. And many effective herbicides are also very potent pesticides, and that they're lethal to fish as well. And so we need to always make sure each individual herbicide applicator is immediately familiar with the content and meaning of the product label. And we need to make sure our restoration sites are planned in conjunction with wildlife consultations. I put this little photo there on the bottom, just a generic screen grab of a gentleman in a yellow vest pointing at, So we're having consultations with our biology team, with cultural resources and all that, making sure the work that we're planning to do is in keeping with best practices and best theories in an interdisciplinary environment. So it's not just, this works for us, we're going to go do it, but have we talked to the fish people? Have we talked to the bird people? Is this the right time to do that? So the next thing is, it's kind of hard to see, but that's a spill kit. That's the kind of thing that I hope folks know that they should be taking out into the field when using herbicide, especially. It's just a very highly absorbent material. If there's a large spill, you can kind of pack that around the spill. It'll soak it up, prevent it as best we can from getting into soil or groundwater environments. But I would encourage folks to think the spill kit shouldn't just be used for herbicide. Particularly when we're down here in the riparian corridor, we're working with gasoline and we're working with bar oil and two-cycle, have a spill kit for your fueling station as well. Also, designate a place on your project site that will be the fueling station. As we're just, you know, hauling 5-gallon fuel jugs all over the project site, that just invites the opportunity for someone to trip, someone to crack a jug, something to spill, something to happen. So we want to have those hazardous materials located in one spot that doesn't move, that's easy to respond to if we have some sort of accident. I know I've got a couple here. We're familiar with these old school gasoline nozzles. I know a lot of fire folks rue the day that these weren't allowed on the fire line anymore, because it does make those old school nozzles do make filling saws a lot faster and easier, but they also severely invite the opportunity for spills, jugs getting knocked over. So we want to make sure that we have the most up-to-date equipment around these hazardous materials so that we're not risking contaminating an especially sensitive environment. That's kind of the underpinning idea, is that these riparian corridors are particularly sensitive, and so we need to take extra precautions when doing this work around that. Another thing, last but not least, another thing to think about is overdoing it. And I'm about to get into more of that, but particularly at the start of the season, I'm consistently reminding the crew, like, hey, take it easy, take it slow. Once you cut into a polygon or cut down a tree or make a treatment or take any action in the riparian corridor, you can't take that back, right? That work that we do, the impact it makes does have there's some finality to it. So it's really important that we are tempering our eagerness, and we're using a very light touch when working in the riparian corridor. It's something that I've seen doesn't necessarily always translate super well from wildland firefighter or forestry or a conservation crew production mentality, where the more acres, the better. A lot of times in the riparian corridor, we want to take a step back. And I always tell the folks, the scalpel is proud of the damage it doesn't do. And so when we work in the riparian corridor, we want to work more like a scalpel with our saw and not like a sledgehammer. We're not just cutting it down. We're looking at each specific stem. Does that make sense? It's a lot slower, but because it's slower, it produces more accurate results, is the word I would use. More precise determinations of, was this project effective or not. It takes time to think about those kinds of things. The next thing about, doing a little too much is the logistics side of the conversation. When you're trying to overdo it, when you're going real fast, when you're working really late in the day or starting really early in the day, if people aren't well rested up, that just invites opportunities for more frequent accidents. The restoration project, hypothetical restoration project we're working on, happens in the context of a multi-day river trip. And while project goals and deliverables and objectives for the restoration site are the reason we're out there doing the work, the river trip, those goals are paramount when it comes to timeliness, safety, not overworking people, right? Not making people put in any free time. We're not asking anybody out there to like work a 12-hour day and only get paid for 10, right? So it's a feat of logistics in and of itself to time a river trip along with the tempo needed to get to a project site and then put in hours of work there. And then you've got to build in time to kind of transition from river running mode to chainsaw mode. You've got to change your clothes. You've got to unpack the gear. You've got to change back. You've got to pack it all back up. I know not every river is practical. Sometimes there are administrative restrictions, or sometimes there are practical restrictions. Maybe it's just too shallow. But on our rafts, we use, you can kind of see on the stern of that boat there, very small, low powered outboard motors. These little 4-stroke, 8 horsepower motors don't get the boat up on plane. They mainly only go 6 or 7 miles an hour in the wind, but it really preserves the physical vitality and just the well-being of our river rangers to be able to get in the boat, kind of put it on auto, let that motor push through the strong wind at the end of the day on their way to the next campsite or the next job site. Um, I think it would be so much harder to put in long work days on the restoration site if we didn't also use low power outboard motors to get through some of the long, flat, windy sections that we operate on. And to be more specific, these 4-stroke motors are substantially quieter than the old 2-strokes that you might see on a lot of wreck boaters and dinosaurs, 20-year-old things. They make much lower decibels, in the 60 decibel range, not the 80. They're quieter than the chainsaws, I would say. So just a little pointing that thing out there for gear. So the takeaway is really that it's vital to know and have a really good idea of your timing. What is your project site going to be like? How long are you going to need to spend there? How long is it going to take to get there? I think this work is really best done by folks who specialize and have run that section of river they're doing many times before. So they kind of they can look at the weather, they can look at the time of day, and they can really get down to that 15-minute resolution of how long is this going to take us. That's a really helpful thing. Becoming confident in your cruise tempo, there's human factors also. So knowing, we're pretty tired right now. It's day 5. Maybe it's a good time to sleep in, right? Maybe we actually need a little bit of a break this afternoon, taking a longer lunch or knocking off early just because it's getting hotter than we anticipated, right? So all of those things kind of keep this trip tempo and logistical tempo it's a moving target, really. And finally, okay, I would like to, I kind of blew the big reveal there. I'd like to deconstruct a lot of the things that we were talking about. To start, most invasive phreatophytes are not growing to very large size classes. These riparian woody plants that are noxious invasive woody plants grow more like shrubs than trees. We're not really talking about sea trees out here. They're not falling ponderosas or any heavy wood or anything like that. The logistics and outfitting these kinds of trips can be pretty daunting, even prohibitive for many agencies. So this is a thing to think about. Partnership is, who in the interagency partnership can bring what resources to the table, right? It's difficult to synchronize all the moving cogs in this machine: travel time, project time, weather conditions, training. All of that is working to try and throw you off your schedule, right? And as we introduce more complicated equipment, the time needed to mitigate the risks of more complicated equipment increases. So more time spent on planning, more time spent on the safety brief, more time spent on logistics, the more and more complicated these things get. So what is a good solution to that? Going to kind of throw out everything I just said. I am absolutely in love with the hand saw. Remember, small plants, logistically complicated, cumbersome and difficult to pack. All of those things kind of get tossed out the window, are completely mitigated by the handsaw. They're a tenth the cost. These are ultra light. You can put 12 handsaws in a dry box in the place that it would take one powered gasoline chainsaw, and it's gas and it'll borrow oil and all that. Because there's no fuel, there's no risk of spillage. because there's no heat, there's no risk of fire, because it's not powered, the odds, the likelihood of injury, operator injury, is substantially lower. Um, there's no battery, so you don't need to recharge it. You don't need to figure out how to store a lithium ion battery safely on a whitewater river trip. That question comes up a lot. There are much less intensive training requirements. You can break down the right way to use a handsaw in a couple of hours versus S212 can take you, 4 days or a week. They're harder to break and easier to fix. And when it comes to user fatigue, that's the people want to use the gas saw, the electric saw, because it goes faster and it's easier. But I would say compared to lugging around that 13-pound gas saw through the thick brush with an inch of Kevlar around your legs and long sleeves and a hard hat and all this other stuff, the handsaw is light and fast and safe. And so that's going to put a quick plug in there. I know the Wilderness Gang is already very familiar with that, the crosscut and the minimum required tool and all that. I would suggest that even if we're not in wilderness, we might consider those principles when working in the riparian corridor for all of the reasons I just mentioned. So, that looks like it brought us just to about a half an hour. I'd like to give the last 15 minutes or so for questions and comments. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. These are just some photos. Speaking of partnership, that's the River Ranger crew here doing the Swiftwater course. This is Izzy Weimholt, Grand County Noxious Weed Supervisor, the Utah Conservation Corps. Couldn't do it without partners, so big thanks to them. I'm going to stop sharing and minimize this window, and maybe we can, if anybody does have any questions, I'd be happy to spend the next 15 minutes just chatting.
Thanks, Tony. I've encouraged people to ask some questions, and also if they do have questions to tell us who they are or what kind of work they do, that might give you some context. As they're thinking about it, after it's so much involved, tell them why you like this work.
Sure. Well, the Colorado and the Green River in Utah, where I work, but across the West, are regularly acknowledged as one of the more endangered rivers in America. It's been on American Rivers list several times. There are lots of threats to the Colorado and the Green River. There are only some things that I'm able to help with, given the scope and responsibilities of my agency. And so, what is our tool with the Utah Division of Forestry? Vegetation management. And that was sort of like the 101 talk that I just gave, but we can get into like the 301 talk about how vegetation management in the riparian corridor really does have a huge impact on the hydrologic flow regime of the river. These invasive plants, they add surface friction to riverbanks, they invade side tertiary channels and backwaters. And so we're seeing, coupled with several other things, the loss of environmental flow regimes, climate change, drought, water consumption, the river is becoming a single deep incised channel. And the natural pattern of the Colorado River is a broad, shallow, braided channel. And I can't do much about water consumption. I can't do much about climate change, but I can help reduce the surface friction in these riparian corridors and allow water, when we get our high water years, to like trickle out and create some more floodplain connectivity. River is really important to me, and so that's just why I've got to do everything I can with what I've got.
We do have a question from Catherine. I have been a land-based seasonal off and on for about 15 years, but I'm interested in getting more water-based experience. I'm interested in becoming a river ranger. Where should I start? I know that RMS is a certification. Well, the beginning of what I am in contact with NAU Flagstaff about earning one, the certificate program with students. Yeah, go ahead.
So that's a great question. And I would say always be looking for opportunities. And I don't know your personal situation, but oftentimes river ranger jobs come up and they're very scattered around. So sometimes it takes, moving to a new place to find a new job, particularly in the river cohort when we're talking about permanent positions. They get filled and they stay filled because people really like those jobs. I think I'm always looking for candidates, especially in your circumstance with so much experience. I'm sure that you should be able to, with your resume and your cover letter and your interview, demonstrate a wealth of other skills and knowing how to take those other skills you have and how they relate to their value in a river program. It really sets people apart saying, like, well, I'm an EMT and blah, 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 or well, I'm a, this and blah, blah, blah. So it's all about like combining those skill sets. It's not just a single track thing, it's a blended experience. I also saw biodegradable bar oil when running chainsaws, working with vegetable-based hydraulic oil for heavy equipment. I am not familiar with biodegradable bar oil. That is something that we definitely would look into. I have heard of vegetable oil in heavy equipment and stuff like that. Most of our work is all manual work, hand work with chainsaws and things like that. And typically, um, it works in twofold. We try to do the majority of our saw work in the fall. This is because one, the tamarisk is more sensitive to treatment. It's weaker at that point, and so the effectiveness of our projects is higher in the fall. Likewise, more to your point, um, in the fall, we know that we have a whole season for herbicides and things like that to dissipate into the environment and not go straight into the waterway. We never really do this work in the springtime when we know the high water is about to come up, right? Because we don't want there to be a rapid runoff and now these, liquid contaminants are going straight into the water system. We try to do it at a time of year that is ecologically most intelligent. Um, there's a survey here. Let's not. Steel makes a good biodegradable. Yeah, that's a. I will definitely look into that. That's also, folks from Oregon. You guys have so much more water there, and you're probably more than the folks out here in the desert. Maybe have more experience and definitely more time spent thinking about the water stuff. Whereas out here in the desert, man, it's dry. Well, I've got a little bit more time. If anybody has one more question, don't forget to take the survey.
Tony, do y'all take saplings down at the same time when you're cutting out? Are you replanting anything at the same time, or is that a different trip?
That is a great question. Usually, our restoration polygons kind of run on a 7-year cycle, seems like the average. And so we'll work in one place seasonally for several seasons. And the planting the saplings usually comes toward the 5th or 6th or 7th or 10th year. The first thing we do after chainsaw work is seeding. We kind of try to take the long-term prescription for a restoration site and use the same sort of theory as post-fire rehabilitation, things we've learned from bear teams and stuff like that. So we try to start by seeding annual rhizomatous grass or perennial rhizomatous grasses that we can mow and go back the next season. And because when we do this cutting, we know that we're going to promote a lot of invasive annual plants, cheatgrass, kochia, right? It's going to be there. And so we'll come back with a mowable native grass mix, seed it very heavily. And so that over the years, as we mow, we're sort of knocking down the invasive annual seed bank, promoting a perennial native seed bank. And then once we've got a little bit of soil and a little bit of O layer, we can start to plant shrubs. Those shrubs will act as nursery plants for saplings, a little bit of windbreak, a little bit of shade, a little bit of keeping snow in the area over the summertime. And so we use this sort of like post-fire regeneration model in our restoration sites too.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony.
Is that all in the fall, Tony? Or
the majority of our work is done in the fall. We in the late spring and early summer, we're looking for very specific listed herbaceous weeds that we can dig up or treat or monitor and map for treatment later in the fall, because we have that hydrologic condition where the river is going to rise 15 feet on us if we start working in April. So we wait for that river to come back down. And then in September, October, there's the monitoring in the spring and the implementation in the fall.
Do you use beetles?
We do have some biocontrols for various species. We haven't had to release a tamarisk beetle in many years. That's a whole other presentation about the tamarisk beetle.
Right.
But we're having trouble with knapweed in my area, and I've found the knapweed gall wasp and the knapweed gall midge are both doing very well. Canyonlands National Park and Dinosaur National Monument have done some releases, and we're seeing them propagate. And I like them. They're a little bit safer because they target the reproductive systems of the plants, not necessarily the plants themselves. So it's a much slower effect. It's not quite so dramatic as the impacts we've seen from the tamarisk. Everything with a light touch.
Wow. It's everything we want to know and more.
I bet. Well, thank you so much for listening, guys. I really appreciate the opportunity. To Risa and James and Dusty as well. My contact info is in the PowerPoint slides. I'm sure Risa can get those to anybody who wants them. Happy to answer more questions or follow up after the fact. Please feel free to reach out.